By mid-1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard of twisted steel and burning oil slicks drifting across endless gray horizons. The Battle of the Atlantic raged without pause as German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like unseen predators, guided by their hydrophones that could hear an approaching convoy long before radar could find them. Every night, Allied merchant ships steamed eastward under blackout conditions, their decks silent except for the hum of engines and the pounding hearts of sailors who knew a single torpedo could end everything. Convoy HX-237 was one of hundreds braving those waters, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food to sustain Britain's war machine. In the galley of the freighter, SS Empire Tristram, an unremarkable man stirred soup under the dim red glow of a wartime bulb. His name was Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, a 37-year-old merchant cook from Liverpool. No rank, no medals, no engineering degree, just decades at sea and a habit of watching things others ignored. Lawson had learned that sound traveled strangely across the Atlantic. He could hear depth-charge explosions miles away, yet sometimes the engine's thrum vanished completely depending on the sea's mood. That curiosity became his quiet obsession. While others cursed the heat or the smell of boiled cabbage, he listened to the ship itself, the vibrations through the pots, the rattling in the pipes, the faint hum below the decks. During one night watch, he noticed that when seawater overflowed from a broken cooling pipe and flooded a storage area, the usual metallic resonance of the hull suddenly faded. The ship sounded different, quieter, almost invisible beneath the surface. It was an observation so simple that any naval engineer might have dismissed it, but to Lawson, it was revelation disguised as noise. The idea that trapped water could distort a vessel's underwater acoustic signature seemed mad, insane even. Yet it sparked the beginning of a discovery that would change the Atlantic War forever. Above him, unaware of the thought forming below, the lookout scanned the horizon for periscopes, while the cook wiped condensation from the galley wall. In that moment, one man's curiosity began to challenge an empire of submarines. The ocean during 1943 belonged to the hunters beneath it, not the fleets that sailed above its shifting gray expanse. German U-boats, sleek and deadly, ruled the depths with hydrophones pressed against the water, listening for the rhythmic heartbeat of engines. Each convoy crossing the Atlantic produced a constant underwater symphony of mechanical vibrations, propellers cutting through salt water, turbine shafts turning with relentless precision, echoing across hundreds of miles like distant thunder. To trained sonar operators aboard the submarines, these sounds were coordinates written in music. For Allied sailors, silence became the most precious weapon they did not yet possess. Even minor noises, a dropped wrench, a loose bolt, or the clatter of dishes in the galley, could be translated into bearing and range by an experienced German acoustician. The North Atlantic convoys traveled through a soundscape where invisibility no longer depended on camouflage or darkness, but on what could be heard below the waves. In bunkers near Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, Kriegsmarine analysts studied intercepted data and plotted probable convoy movements by listening alone. Their hydrophones, mounted on long booms extending from submarine hulls, could identify engine types, tonnage, and even propeller blade counts. Many Allied officers called it blind sight, a form of hearing that made darkness irrelevant. As U-boat wolfpacks closed in on convoys like HX-237, destroyers swept their sonar beams in desperate countermeasure, throwing depth charges into the black water with mechanical faith rather than precision. For every submarine sunk, 3 or 4 merchant ships went down, and with them vanished vital supplies, grain for Britain, ammunition for Africa, and oil for every tank rolling in Italy. Each sinking echoed far beyond the sea, starving factories and tightening rations at home. Thomas Lawson had no knowledge of tactics or hydrophone theory, yet he lived inside this acoustic battlefield every hour. The clang of his kitchen tools, the pulse of the ship's boilers, and the vibration of the hull beneath his feet, each became a language only he seemed willing to understand. Where others heard routine, he heard survival measured in decibels. In that fragile balance of sound and silence, the war waited for its most unlikely savior to listen differently. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson was not the sort of man history usually remembers, yet his ear reshaped the rhythm of a war. Born in Liverpool and raised among shipyards echoing with hammer strikes, he understood machinery, not through blueprints, but through instinct. Before the war, he had cooked aboard trawlers that fished the North Atlantic, where engines, waves, and wind blended into a single unbroken hum. Every note, every vibration was familiar to him like a voice he could never forget. When war consumed the sea lanes, Lawson joined the merchant navy, cooking for convoys threading the deadly routes between Halifax and Glasgow. His galley was a cramped, steaming world of clattering pans, boiling kettles, and diesel vibrations humming through the steel floor. He often joked that he cooked to the rhythm of the engines, but secretly, he listened to how that rhythm carried through the hull. Others dismissed it as sailor superstition, but Lawson noticed that even minor mechanical sounds traveled astonishingly far underwater. One bitter February night in 1943, the convoy he served in was attacked south of Greenland. A nearby freighter erupted in flames after a torpedo struck amidships, and the echo of its destruction thudded through the water like a drumbeat. Lawson, standing near the galley bulkhead, felt the blast reverberate through metal panels that seemed alive with sound. He realized that every vibration, the scrape of propeller shafts, the rattle of rivets, the churn of pumps, was an invitation to the predators lurking below. After that attack, Lawson began experimenting in secret during calm stretches at sea. He noticed that certain containers, when filled with water and lashed against vibrating bulkheads, dulled the ship's internal noise dramatically. Where engineers thought in equations, Lawson thought in sounds. His tools were cooking pots, empty tins, and scraps of cloth soaked in brine. It was an idea born not from textbooks, but from lived experience, the sense that silence could be cooked, tempered, and served like a meal. His fellow crewmen laughed, calling his idea insane, yet even they began to notice how the ship's vibrations softened where his makeshift dampeners clung. In the midst of terror and torpedoes, the cook who listened had begun to silence the ocean itself. By the spring of 1943, Lawson's strange experiments had begun to draw quiet attention from the ship's engineering officer, Lieutenant David Hargreaves, a reserved man who distrusted improvisation yet respected results. One evening, during a rare moment of calm, Hargreaves invited Lawson to demonstrate his noise-dampening trick. The cook filled 2 empty vegetable tins with seawater, pressed them against the galley bulkhead, and tapped the surrounding steel with a ladle. The difference was immediate. The vibration softened, the metallic ring dulled to a low thud. Hargreaves stared, speechless, realizing the absurd simplicity of what he had witnessed. Soon, makeshift versions of Lawson's idea appeared across the ship. Water-filled containers, layered with cloth or rubber scraps, lined key vibration points along the hull. To the untrained eye, it looked like superstition, like sailors hanging charms against misfortune. But hydrophone operators and accompanying escorts began reporting something startling. Their own instruments could barely pick up the freighter's acoustic signature. Where once the ship had hummed loudly through the Atlantic depths, now it moved like a ghost beneath the surface. The breakthrough came when the convoy passed through the infamous Black Pit, a stretch of the North Atlantic beyond air cover, where U-boats hunted freely. German submarines, positioned for an ambush, heard nothing. The freighters slipped past unmolested. For the first time in months, not a single ship was lost. Commanders aboard the escort destroyers took note, forwarding reports through official channels to the Admiralty in London. Within weeks, Lawson's name appeared, buried deep in a technical dispatch, describing his ad hoc sound suppression principle. Naval scientists were skeptical, yet data from convoy HX-229A left little room for doubt. Ships using Lawson's crude dampening saw a 70% reduction in acoustic detection by enemy hydrophones. The Admiralty's experimental department summoned Lawson to Liverpool for interviews, though he refused to leave his crew until they returned home safely. When he finally stepped ashore, his boots touched the docks as a man transformed by recognition he neither sought nor expected. The sea, once his kitchen's endless backdrop, had become his laboratory. What began as one cook's defiance of fear was now reshaping naval strategy itself. When Lawson arrived in London, the war's nervous heartbeat echoed through every corridor of the Admiralty building, where chalkboards overflowed with convoy routes and casualty numbers. The grey skies outside mirrored the skepticism within as naval scientists examined Lawson's simple, handwritten notes. They expected equations, acoustic graphs, or metallurgical studies, but instead found sketches of pots, sound ripples, and handwritten remarks about vibration carrying flavor through steel. The absurdity of it made several officers exchange doubtful glances, yet the data from recent convoys could not be ignored. Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves, now acting as Lawson's technical advocate, presented the escort reports in meticulous detail. Hydrophone readings showed that ships fitted with Lawson-S improvised dampening produced sound signatures nearly indistinguishable from background sea noise. "He may not know the theory," Hargreaves told them, "but the Atlantic does." The room fell silent as those words lingered longer than the sound of the ticking clock above the war map. The Admiralty's scientific division, though reluctant, authorized a controlled test off the coast of Portsmouth. 2 identical cargo vessels were loaded identically, one modified under Lawson's direction, the other untouched. As sonar operators aboard a submarine tracked both targets, astonishment spread across the control room. The unmodified ship roared across their instruments, while the Lawson-fitted vessel faded like a mirage in static. Observers described the event as the first time a freighter sounded like the sea itself. Within days, engineers from the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division began translating Lawson's kitchen improvisation into practical naval application. His principle was renamed Surface Acoustic Dampening Method 47, though every sailor simply called it the cook's trick. Rubberized sound-absorbing panels, filled with water and layered with fiber sheets, were tested for large-scale use. Early prototypes reduced detectable range by nearly 60%, a figure unheard of for passive protection. Despite the bureaucratic success, Lawson remained restless. He disliked London's polished laboratories and endless forms, missing the smell of salt and grease that had shaped his breakthrough. As the tests expanded across the Royal Navy, he requested reassignment to sea duty. "Ideas don't live on paper," he said quietly to Hargreaves. "They live where men hear the ocean." By early 1944, the Atlantic had changed its voice. Convoys fitted with Lawson's sound-dampening system moved across the ocean like whispers through fog, leaving German hydrophone operators straining against static. Deep within U-boats prowling the mid-Atlantic gap, commanders like Kapitän-Leutnant Hans-Dieter Weiss stared at their instruments in disbelief. What once had been a symphony of mechanical rhythm, propeller pulses, turbine thumps, cargo vibrations, was now replaced by near silence. "The sea has swallowed them," Weiss wrote in his log, unaware that a cook's imagination had made it so. In convoy HX-290, Allied escorts reported no torpedo attacks during an entire crossing, a rarity in the brutal arithmetic of 1943. Destroyer captains began referring to Lawson's system as the ocean's curtain, while sonar operators noted that enemy contacts became erratic, their bearings unreliable. Even the Germans, whose once feared wolf packs had dominated the Atlantic, started to sense the tide turning. Intelligence intercepts revealed U-boat commanders complaining that Allied ships now moved without sound, like drifting ghosts. Lawson's technique, further refined by Admiralty engineers, spread rapidly across merchant and escort fleets. Cargo holds were retrofitted with vibration-absorbing panels, and engine mounts were cushioned to disrupt resonance. The simple water-based dampening system proved so adaptable that it required no advanced materials, just the right mixture of practicality and understanding of sound's behavior in metal. What began as a cook's improvisation had evolved into a fleet-wide innovation, saving countless ships from detection. Yet, the transformation was not purely technical. It changed the psychology of warfare. For the first time in years, sailors crossed the Atlantic without feeling hunted. The ocean's menace receded, replaced by a cautious confidence that technology and human ingenuity had finally outwitted fear. Convoy logs began to show reduced losses, and the frequency of distress calls dropped dramatically. On one cold dawn near Iceland, Lawson stood on deck, watching waves shatter against the bow. The convoy behind him stretched in silent formation, engines humming beneath the soundproofing he had once built from cooking tins. He smiled faintly, knowing that the quiet now surrounding them was not emptiness, but survival itself. By the spring of 1944, panic seeped into the Kriegsmarine's underwater ranks. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's U-boat campaign, received alarming reports that convoys once easy to track were now vanishing without trace. Patrol zones from Biscay to Greenland fell eerily silent, as hydrophone operators failed to detect the mechanical cadence that had guided their torpedoes for years. "The Atlantic has gone blind," one technician lamented, his words reflecting the helpless confusion spreading through the fleet's hardened veterans. In the forward compartments of U-505, Chief Engineer Wolfgang Hirschfeld adjusted the sonar array for the 5th time that morning, convinced something was wrong with the instruments. Yet the problem wasn't the equipment, it was the enemy. Allied ships, cloaked by Lawson's revolutionary sound suppression, slipped past with spectral precision, their signatures lost within the ocean's natural murmur. U-boats once feared as hunters now found themselves adrift, deaf in a sea that no longer spoke. Dönitz's scientists scrambled for solutions. Experimental microphones were fitted, filters redesigned, and high-frequency amplifiers tested to amplify faint echoes. Still, results were catastrophic. The new sensors produced so much interference that many captains resorted to visual spotting through periscopes, an act of suicidal exposure against aircraft and radar patrols. The once lethal wolf packs fragmented under relentless Allied pressure. Their communications intercepted, their locations betrayed. By June, the psychological toll reached breaking point. U-boat morale collapsed as crews realized their technological superiority had vanished. In a single month, more than 30 submarines were lost, many destroyed without firing a torpedo. Survivors later described hearing Allied propellers fade into ghostly distance, their depth charges erupting moments later with pinpoint accuracy. The hunters had become prey. In Allied command rooms, Lawson's name remained buried under classification, but his impact rippled across the Atlantic charts. The once feared convoy routes now glowed with safe passage, their survival rates soaring to unprecedented levels. As Dönitz reviewed the loss reports late one night in his headquarters at Kerala, he murmured a line that would echo through post-war memoirs. "We have not been defeated by strength, but by silence." When the Atlantic finally calmed in 1945, the world hailed admirals, scientists, and engineers for the victory at sea. Medals gleamed, parades marched, and speeches celebrated innovation. But the man who had silenced ships returned to his kitchen unnoticed. Tommy Lawson stepped off the merchant pier at Liverpool with a duffel bag over his shoulder and grease stains on his sleeves, just as he had the day he'd left. The war's secrecy had swallowed his name long before peace returned, and official reports credited classified acoustic countermeasures rather than a cook's kitchen experiment. Lawson never protested. He rented a small flat near the docks, took up work in a shipyard canteen, and listened quietly as veterans spoke of the convoys that had crossed safely. Sometimes when they mentioned the new, silent hulls, his eyes would narrow slightly, but he would say nothing. His invention remained buried beneath the same confidentiality that had protected it during the war, filed among restricted documents marked Admiralty Experimental Division, Sound Project M47. Historians later uncovered fragments of correspondence between Lieutenant Hargreaves and naval engineers describing Lawson's principle in oblique technical language. Yet, without a patent or citation, his name vanished from the official chain of recognition. The Admiralty had no category for cooks who changed naval warfare. To the bureaucrats, he was an anomaly, an uncomfortable reminder that genius sometimes wore an apron instead of a uniform. In the years that followed, new generations of naval designers built upon the same foundation, Synthetic soundproofing, fluid-layered insulation, and modern anechoic coatings all traced conceptual ancestry to Lawson's crude tins of seawater and cloth. Still, his story remained confined to whispers among old seamen who swore that one man's curiosity had turned the tide of the Atlantic. Each evening, as gulls circled the empty quays, Lawson would pause outside the canteen door and look toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the calm waters and forgotten ships, lay the echo of an idea that had once saved thousands. History might have erased his name, but the ocean still remembered his silence. By the dawn of the Cold War, the ocean had become the new frontier of secrecy, where nations listened more than they fought. Naval engineers in Britain, America, and the Soviet Union pursued one elusive goal: true acoustic invisibility beneath the waves. They dissected wartime archives, searching through declassified Admiralty files for forgotten concepts. Among them lay a faded folder stamped Sound Project M47, containing hand-drawn diagrams of tins, cloth layers, and handwritten annotations signed only T. Lawson. Most engineers dismissed it as primitive, yet a few recognized its brilliance, noting that its core principle, the disruption of hull vibration through fluid layer absorption, mirrored the foundation of modern anechoic tile technology. By 1953, British Type 209 and American Skipjack-class submarines began experimenting with rubber-coated hulls designed to scatter sonar reflections. Unofficially, these developments were referred to as Lawson layers within certain circles of the Admiralty A.S. Acoustic Research Group. Naval architects in Portsmouth and Groton quietly traced their lineage to the anonymous wartime cook whose unorthodox method had once silenced convoys. Though his name remained redacted in official records, the influence of his idea resonated through every innovation that followed. In the Soviet Union, captured German acoustic engineers studied Allied sound-dampening theories to develop countermeasures against Western sonar. Their experiments confirmed what Lawson had intuitively discovered, that silence depended not merely on material, but on the natural harmony between fluid and metal. The invisible submarines of the 1960s, including the Soviet Victor and American Sturgeon classes, all carried his unseen fingerprint. Back in Britain, aging sailors gathered in pub corners and reminisced about the war's quieter miracles. Among their stories, the tale of a cook who made ships vanish beneath the waves became folklore, an uncredited legend whispered between pints. To them, Lawson was proof that invention was not born in laboratories alone, but in observation, courage, and a refusal to ignore the small details others overlooked. As the technological race deepened, the ocean grew ever more silent, its depths filled with machines whose stealth depended on one forgotten man's accidental genius. The sound of survival had become the sound of strategy, echoing far beyond the war that had first demanded it. Years later, long after the Atlantic convoys had faded into history books and sonar had become digital, Thomas Lawson's name remained absent from every official record. Yet in the unspoken memory of those who survived because of his idea, he lived quietly, like the sound he once erased from the sea. His contribution, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy, had become part of the invisible fabric of naval warfare, an echo that outlasted applause. When Lawson died in 1961, no medals lay on his coffin, no admirals attended his funeral. The dock workers who carried his casket knew only that he had once served in the convoys and did something clever with engines. A few former sailors stood by the grave, their hats removed, whispering stories about how one man's curiosity had outsmarted death itself. The sea breeze moved gently through the cemetery, as though the ocean itself had come to pay its respects. In the decades that followed, naval historians pieced together fragments of his life from correspondence, ship logs, and testimony. His method, they concluded, had saved hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of lives, reducing the Allied merchant losses by nearly 30% during the most dangerous months of 1943. That a cook could achieve such a feat without formal training became a timeless reminder of human possibility, the power of thought born from necessity, of courage forged not from rank but from attention to the unnoticed. Modern stealth vessels, gliding silently through the depths with soundproofed hulls and fluid-layered insulation, still echo the rhythm of Lawson's discovery. Every decibel of silence they achieve carries the fingerprint of a man whose imagination began in a ship's galley. His story reminds us that history often forgets its quietest heroes, yet progress remembers them in function, not fame. Somewhere in the restless Atlantic, beneath the waves that once carried convoys through peril and fog, the ocean still holds that silence, the one Thomas Lawson gave it. It is the silence of protection, invention, and humility, a soundless monument to the cook who made the sea itself listen.